Breaking news uncovered that a case gone cold since 2010 may have officially been solved. An arrest of a possible serial killer was made in July of 2023. It took 13 years for a charge to be made in the murder of the Gilgo Four. However, these weren't the only victims found in the area. Why did it take so long to capture an alleged monster? How did he get away with it for over a decade? And how many victims did he really take the lives of? You are such a genuine gem. Thank you for clicking on my video. I'm Brooke Makenna, and we are diving into everything surrounding this case and about the alleged killer who was recently taken into custody in New York. And this was just a few days ago from when I'm filming this. It was in July. I believe July 15th is when he was arrested. However, they have been on this killer's trail for about a year now, and it took up until now to have enough evidence where they felt like they could finally arrest him. There was also the fact that it was believed he was going after more victims, so they wanted to jump on it, get him in custody before he could do so. So there's so much to get into. This is a case that has been widely talked about for years due to the fact that nobody knew who could have done this, and now we have allegedly way more about this killer than anyone ever expected in this case. I also want to thank our sponsor, MD Hair. You guys are always so sweet in telling me that my hair looks healthy and thick, but the truth is it is actually naturally pretty thin, and I'm always looking for ways to make it healthier and more voluminous, especially trying all different sorts of serums and shampoos and conditioners and different supplements that I think will help, and trying to put them all together myself. And so when I first started looking into MD Hair, I was so genuinely shocked that it wasn't just the shampoo and conditioner claiming to do all of the work. It actually has products that are going to help you from the inside out. MD Hair is made for people with hair loss, or if you are losing hair due to pregnancy or stress, just a natural thin hair that you have. They're actually the world's first medical grade hair care treatment, and you can get it customized to you through a quiz online, as well as a scalp analysis through pictures. Not to mention that the products that they send you are guaranteed to be sustainable and clean as well. Hair is something that I think you should always invest in. It's one of the first things that people notice about you, and it can definitely be a confidence booster. I knew that I had to tell you guys about it when MD Hair told me that you guys can use code BROOK70 for 70% off your first kit of MD Hair. That's right, you can get 70% off your first month of full-sized customized products. So just click that link down below. Now with this case, there are many different timelines that we could start with. We could explore, we could start with the arrest and go backwards. However, I'm going to start this story in 2010 in New York with a woman named Shannan Gilbert, who was living in Long Island as a 24-year-old. She was working as a sex worker, and on May 1st, she had visited Oak Beach to meet with a client named Joseph Brewer at his home, which was at this luxury gated community. It was a nicer area. And so she had actually been driven by a man named Michael Pack, who was allegedly her driver, who would often bring her to her clients. Other than that, I'm not sure really the relationship between the two of them. However, that night she would end up going, and she would then make a 911 call that lasted around 20 minutes. On this call, Shannan could be heard saying, "Somebody's after me. There's somebody after me." Now, this was around 4:51 in the morning. However, the operator really couldn't get her to talk to her, and so the only thing Shannan was really saying was that somebody was after her and for help, and she didn't know her address, so she was asking, "Can you trace the phone?" And the operator was saying that she couldn't. Now, while looking into this recording afterwards, the man's voice was believed to be her driver, Michael Pack, and he was asking her if she was okay, and also trying to get her to leave the home of the client that she was at.
What's going on?
Hello, there's somebody after me.
What?
Somebody after me.
Somebody is harassing you?
After me.
Who?
Can you trace where I am?
Let me talk to him.
Where are you, ma'am?
I don't know.
You're driving right now?
No, I'm inside the house.
What house?
I don't know. Can you trace where I am?
No, I can't.
Please. Stop it, please. Please stop.
No, time to go. Go that way, please. Come on, let's go. Come on, we're all going outside. Come on, go outside. Come on, all of us. Come on, we're all going outside. Come on.
No, please. Please stop it, no.
Let me fix that.
Please stop it, no. Please stop it, please. Please stop it, please. No, what are you going to do to me? What are you going to do to me? Stop it.
Please, get him out of here.
Please, are you going to kill me?
Come on, you freaking down. Come on.
I'm in the middle of nowhere.
Let's go back to Manhattan. All right? I don't know why you doing that.
All right, I'll say I was lying. You were part of this all along.
Hold on, I got Manhattan just now.
What's wrong?
Huh?
What happened?
These people are plotting to kill me.
Shut up.
And this is when Shannan allegedly ran to the neighbor of Joseph Brewer and to knock on their door, and she was asking for help, and so this neighbor ended up calling 911 as well. And at this time, the call that Shannan was on to 911 cut out. So this neighbor called 911 around 5:22 and was saying that Shannan was running around screaming that a guy was trying to follow her. However, the neighbor said that the man who was her driver, Michael Pack, was the man she was talking about. Then Shannan would run to another neighbor, and this neighbor called 911 as well, saying that Shannan was in danger. At this point, Shannan was said to run off and completely disappear. Now, investigators had gone and searched the area, and they believed that she had gotten lost in the nearby marshland. And when they arrived, Shannan was gone, but so was Michael Pack. Now, 2 days after Shannan vanished, that is when her mother, Mari, would allegedly get a phone call from one of the neighbors in the area. Now, this wasn't allegedly any of the neighbors that had called 911 on her that night. This was a different neighbor, a man named Peter Hackett, who allegedly told Mari that he was taking care of Shannan and that he also had a home for wayward girls, which is why he was helping her out. Now, when Mari began to tell people this, that this Peter had Shannan in his home, she received another call from Peter 3 days later. And Peter was now saying that he never had any contact with Shannan, nor had he called her before. But when Mari told the police this, they confirmed that Peter had called Mari twice. Now, this is very important to remember later in the case. But throughout that year, during the search for Shannan, she could not be located. However, a new search would begin on December 11th, 2010 on the shoulder of Ocean Parkway. That is when 4 bodies would be located. However, none of them belonged to Shannan Gilbert. Cadaver dogs began to alert to what was found to be skeletal remains in burlap bags. Within 500 feet, all of these 4 bodies were found wrapped up in this burlap. There was camouflage as well, and these were all women who had all been strangled to death. 4 of these women could be identified, and 3 of them actually had missing persons reports made on them, and the 4th one was still identified, and all of them were found to be sex workers who used Craigslist to sell their services. So they did have something in common. They were also said to be very petite. So of the 4 women identified, one of the women was named Maureen Brainerd, who was a 25-year-old who had vanished 3 years prior to being found after coming to Manhattan, because this was something she did often for work. She would come and stay a few days, see her clients in New York, and then head home. Except on July 9th of 2007, she told a friend that she was meeting a client outside of the usual motel room that she used, and after that, she was never heard from again. Though a friend of hers claimed to receive a call from an unknown number after that, and this was allegedly a man who said he had seen Maureen in a whorehouse in Queens. Though he would not give up the address, he said he would call her back, but he never did. Another one of the victims was 24-year-old Melissa Bartholomew, who vanished on July 12th of 2009 after telling a friend that she was meeting a man and would be back in the morning. This was said to be a client as well. Now, with Melissa's case, cell phone data showed that she actually traveled from the Bronx to Manhattan, and that is when she disappeared. After she vanished, though, Melissa's sister actually began to receive calls from Melissa's phone, and they continued for the next 5 weeks with a man mocking and insulting Melissa, calling her names. He even asked her little sister if she was a whore like Melissa. The man then allegedly said that Melissa was dead and that he was going to watch her rot. Now, the calls were traced, however, they were in multiple different public areas and no leads were found. A third victim was 22-year-old Megan Waterman, and she disappeared on June 6th of 2010. She had traveled to New York to meet with a client that night, and surveillance footage captured her in her hotel before she left. She was alone, she was completely fine, but she did end up leaving the hotel. She did also have a 3-year-old daughter back home, and interestingly enough, Melissa's friend, a man who described himself as Melissa's pimp, was sentenced to 3 years in federal prison 3 years after Megan's disappearance for trafficking sex workers. However, police didn't believe he had anything to do with Megan's disappearance. The hairs were also found on Megan's body. However, they were so degraded at the time that the technology back then could not actually test them. Amber Costello was another victim. She was the oldest at 27 years old, and she had moved to New York for drug rehab. However, she had relapsed, and by September 2nd, 2010, she would vanish, claiming to go meet a client. And she actually was never reported missing because her friends and family believed she was back in rehab, and so that's why they couldn't get a hold of her. But these 4 became known as the Gilgo 4, and investigators believe that all of these women had been killed by the same person. You see, the first 2 victims vanished 2 years apart, but then the 3rd victim was a year after that, and the 4th victim was 3 months later, and it seemed as though the time period between killings was shortening. However, even though the most known victims in this case were these 4 women, and they were all connected due to the MO, these were not the only victims found. In March of 2011, 3 months after these 4 women were found in the camo burlap bags, the search continued on Ocean Parkway, making sure that there weren't any more bodies, and unfortunately there were, because partial remains of a woman who would later be identified as Jessica Taylor were found. Jessica had actually been found with partial remains prior, 3 years prior actually, because she was a sex worker who was believed to go missing in or before 2003, and the rest of her body was then found on Ocean Parkway. And so she was believed to go missing 4 years prior to the first Gilgo 4 victim, meaning that the timeline could be even further back in history. But then more remains were recovered. It was another partial set of remains of a 24-year-old woman named Valerie Mack, who would later be identified as Valerie. She was also a sex worker, and her other remains had been found back in 2000, 7 years prior to the first Gilgo 4 victim. She had actually been the Manorville Jane Doe before being identified. There were also remains of a female toddler believed to be around 2 years old and likely non-Caucasian, and she has yet to be identified. Around this time, a male of Asian descent was also found, and he was believed to be between the ages of 17 and 23 and had died about 5 to 10 years prior, and a facial reconstruction was created. So I'll show you that photo, but he too has yet to be identified. 8 victims in total were found at this time on Ocean Parkway, yet the first 4 were the only ones connected at this time due to their very similar MOs, and it was theorized that the other 4 victims could be connected to other killers or one other killer in the area as well. And I wish it stopped there, but 2 more sets of partial remains would be found, one being a woman who was called Peaches for a bitten heart-shaped tattoo of a peach on her body. And through DNA, it was found that this woman was actually the mother of the toddler that had been found and unidentified. Neither have been identified, but they are mother and daughter. The other partial remains that were found couldn't be identified. However, they did match remains found back in 1996 on Fire Island, meaning that if all of these were connected, or even some of these were connected, the murders could have gone all the way back to 1996. Investigators then released a partial profile on the believed serial killer, and at this time in 2011 they began to speculate that all 10 of these victims could have been killed by the same person, that this was someone from Long Island, and that it was a Joe C. or an average Joe, a white male in his mid-20s to mid-40s with access to burlap bags, that he was believed to possibly have ties to law enforcement and was very well organized, as well as persuasive and rational enough to get victims to actually meet him. A $25,000 reward was offered at this time. Now, a year after the Gilgo Four were found in the search for Shannan Gilbert, the original victim, Shannan Gilbert, was found. She was found nude about 3/4 of a mile from the client's home where she vanished and near Peter Hackett's backyard. This was the strange neighbor who lied about calling her mother, and the strange thing was Shannan's clothes were found apart from her body, and her clothes were found directly behind his property. Her autopsy deemed the cause and manner of death inconclusive. A private pathologist who was hired by the family said that there were signs that were consistent with manual strangulation. But from then on, investigators deemed Shannan's case as an accidental death, that she had succumbed to the elements, that she had drowned, and so she was not believed to be a victim of the Gilgo Four, even though she had uncovered their bodies. However, her family disagrees that she was not murdered that night. They, in fact, filed a wrongful death suit against Peter Hackett for the fact that he allegedly took Shannan into his home, gave her drugs because he was a former physician, and caused her death. This was ultimately dismissed. Peter was not charged, and the entire Hackett family moved out of New York after this. Peter was also ruled out in the deaths of the Gilgo Four at this time, and Mari, Shannan's mother, still believed that Shannan had been murdered. And at this point, she began to believe that she was actually the fifth victim of the Gilgo Four. Now, in 2015, FBI finally joined this case officially. This only came after the original police chief, James Burke, was indicted for civil rights violations and conspiracy. It was believed he had actually blocked the FBI from originally working on this case for years. And Shannan's family's lawyer came out with a shocking statement at this point, saying that they had a witness who believed that James Burke could actually be connected to the Gilgo Beach murders, that he could be the killer. But a sex worker named Leanne had come to them, saying that she had seen this James Burke, and he was with sex workers, and he grabbed a woman who was this Asian woman by the hair and pulled her down to the ground back in 2011. And then Leanne herself had an experience with James and said he was very violent with her and enjoyed choking her. Leanne strongly believed that this could mean that James was the killer, but James Burke was never classified as an official suspect. Unfortunately, Shannan Gilbert was never included in the victim count, and Mari Gilbert was still searching for justice for her daughter when she herself was murdered. In 2016, Mari's other daughter named Sarah would stab her mother 227 times and bashed her head in with a fire extinguisher. Sarah Gilbert was a 28-year-old and believed to be a schizophrenic who was hearing voices. Her defense claimed that she was hallucinating at the time and that Mari actually died trying to help her daughter during this mental illness. But that is when it was also revealed that Mari had been trying to get help for her daughter and had her daughter even arrested because her daughter Sarah had killed a puppy prior to this. Sarah Gilbert was found guilty of second-degree murder and given 25 to life, and they believed that she knew exactly what she was doing that day. But this mother was killed by her daughter before she could get justice for her other daughter's murder. It's the most tragic thing I've ever heard. The next year, in 2017, the public were led to believe that the Gilgo Beach murder case was close to being solved, as a suspect was finally named. This was a man named John Bittrolff, who was a married father from Long Island. He worked as a carpenter. He was also a hunter who enjoyed killing animals. And growing up, a lot of people said that John was treated like a golden child. He got away with fighting, vandalizing property, stealing, bullying, and one neighbor claimed that he had killed their pet cat when he was young. Others said that he tortured animals, and his nickname was Crazy John B. Now, John had a lengthy criminal record, but he had also gotten away with murder for 20 years, and we're not even talking about the Gilgo Beach murders yet. You see, in 2017, John would be convicted of the murder of 2 sex workers, 2 completely different than the Gilgo victims. This was a woman named Rita Tangredi and Colleen McNamee back in 1993 and 1994. And that was strange considering the last timeline that we have for the victims found was 1996. Now, these 2 sex workers were linked to him through DNA because his brother actually had DNA put into the system. And these women were found to be beaten, sexually assaulted, and left in wooden areas. When John was brought in for questioning, he was saying that he didn't know the women, but he went quiet after they told him, well, we have the DNA and it's connected to you. For these murders, he was sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences. Now, he was thought to be a possible suspect in the Gilgo Beach murders due to the victims being sex workers and also the fact that he lived about 3 miles from where Gilgo Beach victims were found. And, they were all found in a very small area. One of the women that he murdered, Rita, was actually found to be best friends with one of the Gilgo 4 victims, Melissa. It was just a very strange connection, and they strongly believed that he could be involved. However, this suspect, John, was never charged with any of the Gilgo murders, and so they were back to square one. I'm not sure exactly what led them off of his trail and onto another one, but he was not ever officially charged. Now, in 2020, the new police commissioner would release photos of a belt that was evidence that had never been released to the public, and it was believed to be handled by the killer. It did not belong to any of the victims, and this had the letters on it that were either HM or WH embossed into the leather. Then in 2022, it appeared as though answers were within reach. A multi-agency task force was finally put together for this case specifically after so many years of not much being done. And on July 15th of 2023, a 59-year-old man named Rex Heuermann was arrested. He was charged with 3 counts of first degree and 3 counts of second degree murder for Melissa, Megan, and Amber, as well as being the prime suspect of the murder of Maureen. Now, he was said to be in tears while he told his attorney that he did not do this. This Rex is a married dad of 2 who are now adults, and he's an architect who bought his childhood home from his mother, a home that was less than 6 miles away from the victim dumping grounds. He had been on the radar for the past year because of his car, his Chevy Avalanche. You see, police had received a tip very early on in the case about witnesses of Amber's disappearance seeing a specific kind of car. They didn't have much information other than it being a Chevy Avalanche. However, a year prior to this arrest, investigators went back to that tip and they actually began talking to Amber's pimp. He began to say that he witnessed this truck as well, that it was a dark green Chevy that pulled up to Amber's home, and that he actually saw the driver as well. This driver was the size of an ogre with big glasses and bushy hair. This was the first time that they had a description of this possible suspect at all. And little did they know that this specific truck was sitting right outside of the suspected killer's home for all of these years. He had never gotten rid of it. When the police began to look into the cars registered in the area that were Chevy Avalanches, they found Rex. This was back in March of 2022 when they first connected this truck to this man, and they began to do surveillance on him for the next 9 months. He looked just like this pimp's description, standing at around 6'4" to 6'6". He was huge. But then in January of 2023, investigators would take a pizza box out of his trash can and send it in for DNA testing. His DNA was found on it, and so in April, the hairs that were on Megan's body were sent over to the lab to compare. And in June, they were found to be a match. Now, on the other 3 Gilgo 4 victims, hairs were found, however, they were female. And they were found to be a match to Rex's wife. However, she was confirmed to be out of town with her kids during all of the murders, and it was believed that her hair was just transferred to Rex's clothing, which transferred onto the victims. So a pizza box is ultimately how they caught a serial killer in 2023. And during the search of his home, at least 7 burner phones were linked to him, and each were believed to be trashed after the victim was murdered. He would use one, contact the victim, and then dispose of it. But he was recently found at the time of his arrest to have purchased another burner phone. This was in May. At the time of his arrest, he was also carrying a burner phone. He was actually arrested while leaving his job, and there is footage of that. Investigators had been watching him this whole time, and he started to interact again with sex workers, and they believed it was just a matter of time before he struck again. It was also found that the disturbing calls where Melissa's family was taunted by a man, they could be traced back to where Rex worked, his office. Rex's search history then revealed that he was obsessed with the Gilgo investigation and the victims as well as their family. Other searches were about sex workers, child abuse, torture, and he once Googled, why could law enforcement not trace the calls made by the Long Island serial killer? As well as, why hasn't the Long Island serial killer been caught? The first suspect that investigators named in this case, John Bittrolff, was Googled as well. Well, like I said, the arrest was finally made of Rex because they were trying to get as much evidence as possible, but then they were having that balance of finding all this evidence, but also making sure that he was not going to kill again while they watched. So he was finally taken into custody and he pled not guilty and was given no bail. It was believed that the profile that was originally given on this serial killer was spot on, that he was this average Joe, that he led a life of chaos yet control. He had no criminal history. He had a college degree. He had an excellent job and a family. And his only question while being arrested was allegedly, is it in the news? It was also found that Rex hadn't paid taxes in years and that he was often filing lawsuits against drivers after they would have accidents, and he would say that he was seriously injured when he wasn't. But once this news broke, people began to come forward with stories of Rex being very strange and that it all made sense now, even though he wasn't someone that you would automatically look at and think is a serial killer. You see, an interior designer came forward to say that she had worked with him after they met at a networking group. You see, he had even asked her about the Gilgo Beach murders. She said that she had told him she had this interest in true crime. He asked about her favorite case, and she was kind of just talking about how, anyone could be a serial killer. And Rex laughed and said that he lived in the Gilgo Beach area. A client of Rex's actually said that she drove him home one night. They talked about why someone would use burlap. So it was apparently very common for this alleged killer to want to boast about what he has allegedly done. Neighbors of Rex from when he was a kid said that he was someone you didn't really want to approach, and former classmates said he was a nerdy guy. He would leave love notes in lockers. He was picked on by the other kids, but neighbors of the adult Rex said that they would actually joke about the fact that he probably had bodies in his backyard. They would avoid his home on Halloween. And many said that he was a quiet man who kept to himself, that he wanted no socialization with any of the neighbors. And he was often woodworking in his garage. Allegedly, Rex had made a plan to retire on secluded property in South Carolina that he owned with his brother Craig. And this is something that has not been spoken about much, but a neighbor of Craig, who lives in South Carolina, said that Craig is a very strange individual as well, that one time he went to cut his grass that's across the street from Craig, and then Craig suddenly came over and hit him with a steel pole. When police were called, Craig simply said, well, I told him not to cut grass on Sunday. Craig is also known to be very hot-headed, and just recently his truck was seized by police. I'm not sure if this is for this investigation or not, but this led many to believe that his home, possibly Craig himself, will be a part of this investigation. Turns out that Craig was convicted of killing a cop back in 1988. He crashed his car into this cop under the influence of cocaine. Now, he was said to be very choked up when he learned that the cop died, and he was sentenced to 3 years. Now, Craig is 2 years younger than his brother Rex and has said to reside in South Carolina for 30 years. So he wasn't in the area of the Gilgo Beach murders. However, seems to be something that investigators are still looking into at this point. Most recently, storage units believed to be linked to Rex have been searched for possible trophies. Boxes and bags have been taken out of the units, out of his home, including 200 guns that were found in a walled-off vault behind a metal door. Now, Rex has not been ruled out in the deaths of the other 6 victims. Now, the 4, he is the prime suspect in 1 and has been charged with the other 3. And so that is where we are in the investigation so far. But his wife and children are actually said to be cooperating with the police. And investigators are certain that there is enough evidence to charge Rex with the Gilgo 4, but there are still the remaining 6 victims, as well as Shannan Gilbert, who is often not even spoken about, whose cases all remain cold. Although it seems as though this alleged killer isn't talking, I'm hoping that investigators can get him to slip up and confess, to confirm or deny for these poor victims and their families. Because if he wasn't involved in these other 7 murders, then there might be another serial killer. There might be multiple killers still out there. This is all we know at the moment. Let me know if you'd like me to keep you updated on confessions, evidence, the future trial. Do you think that all of these victims are connected? Was Shannan murdered that night? That is a huge question in this whole case. If it wasn't for her, these other victims wouldn't have been found. This alleged killer wouldn't have been caught. But was she murdered that night? Was it by a serial killer? Was it by Rex or someone who was with her that night? Someone who was around that area? You know, I think that phone call is just a little bit too strange for this to just be accidental. However, many have pointed to it could have been paranoia, it could have been drugs, mental illness, as to why she was acting so strange, and that could have led to her accidental death. It's heartbreaking, but I can't help but believe that this case wasn't solved for so many years because these victims were all sex workers. We've seen it time and time again, especially in the past, as though their lives mean less. I am so happy that slowly but hopefully soon they are getting justice. For so long, they didn't even know where these people were. And so we now have the bodies. The technology just keeps getting better and better. So I think that there is still hope that we can identify the victims who have not been given names, and we can catch killers if there are more. Because of Shannan Gilbert, a serial killer was taken off the streets. Okay, I'm back because right when I finished filming this, I went online. More information has been revealed, so I wanted to tell you really quick. Basically, a lawyer has said that he believes that there could be an accomplice to Rex in these murders, and it could be a woman who was used to lure in these victims. Also, the family of Rex, his wife and children, have been spoken to by investigators and were allegedly very shocked, to the point where investigators do not believe that they had any indication that Rex was doing any of this or had anything to do with it, that they were just absolutely disgusted, especially when the FBI started to raid their homes and let them know what was going on. I would love if you would subscribe and come back for updates and for other cases. But don't forget to speak up. Your voice is powerful enough, and I love you to absolute pieces.